Thank you for coming to the Medicine Wheel Revisited, Indigenizing the Enlightenment. This event is hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, your community for science and secularism. My name is Shauna Watson. I'm Vice President of CFIC. CFI Canada is Canada's only national nonprofit with the mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We work to equip people to make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. To that end, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for you to engage with subject matter experts on a variety of topics. In these days of physical distancing, CFIC's events and activities are provided online, available from coast to coast to coast. We rely entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events such as this. Please visit our website, centerforinquiry.ca, or email info@centerforinquiry.ca for more information about how to become a member or make a donation. We will be recording this talk for publication on CFIC's YouTube channel, including the question and answer session. If you don't want your name or image to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera and change your screen name. To minimize background noise, we will be muting everyone's microphone. If you have problems with either the audio or video, I suggest you can turn off your video. After the discussion, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be using the Zoom chat to submit the questions by text, and I will pose the question to our guest. I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson. He was Director of Life Skills for the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College in the early 1970s, and Dr. Robertson will share observations from this period, contrasting them with his subsequent 40 years of work in Indigenous counselling and education. Dr. Robertson, welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Shauna. One small correction. I was Director of Life Skills for the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College in the early 1980s. That's where I'd like to begin my talk by talking about that experience. It was actually an early affirmative action program. Now, I should explain that affirmative action at that time, as originally conceptualized, is not did not have the definition of affirmative action today. It did not involve quotas. Affirmative action involved a study that if there's a differential between the numbers of people, in this case, the numbers of people of Indigenous ancestry graduating from university, if there was a discrepancy between that and the expected graduation given population figures, there was a study that investigated the reasons why. Now, a major reason why we discovered was that Indigenous people with high school were entering university without the same skill set at that time as non-Indigenous people, specifically people from reserve communities were having difficulty. So what we did is we tacked on an extra year of university for people in our program, where they would learn essential skills like time-delineated behavior, goal setting, basic mathematical skills that our target population are weak on, problem-solving skills. Many of the skills that were taken for granted by people who were in families that had a university background. By the way, I was the very first person in my extended family to ever go to university. The program was successful. We increased the graduation rate. The people that were graduands, it's been almost 2 generations since then, and they had children, and their children went to university, and for the most part successfully graduated. So this became an intergenerational success. But some of you may be saying, well, isn't that unfair? Indigenous people having to spend an extra year at university in order to graduate. And at this point, we're talking about the undergraduate program. That was the argument that was given, and the program eventually was discontinued for that reason. Now, in a while, I'm going to introduce you to my nephew, Randall Romano, because he helped me with preparing these slides, and this next one was his particular design. I'm going to do share screen here, and hopefully you'll be able to see his work. Can everybody see that Medicine Wheel Revisited, Indigenizing the Enlightenment? Now, I'm sharing the screen. There it is. Okay, here you'll see a chart that shows the percentage of people who, this is people that broken down by Amerindian on reserve, Amerindian off reserve, Métis, and non-Aboriginal. And you'll see that that the percentage that failed to graduate from high school, the lowest percentage of non-graduates here was in the age range 35 to 44, which is roughly, well, shortly after the affirmative action program I told you about. You'll note that for the ages 25 to 34, the on reserve failing to graduate percentage went up from 43.6% to 49.4%. And then for the 20 to 24, it's higher than what it is for those age 45 and older. Now, this chart is a little bit deceiving in one way, and that is the 20 to 24-year-olds still have a chance to go back to do upgrading in order to graduate. So that number over time that you see here, those numbers should be reduced as people get older, depending on the percentage going back. Here we have another chart of the proportion of students who achieve acceptable or exceptional standards in Alberta as measured by standardized testing. And you'll see that from this chart, now this is old statistics, this is from 2000, 2001, but you'll see at that time, for both English language arts and math, the percentage of students in grade 3, 6, and 9 who had acceptable or met acceptable or excellent standards were highest for the non-Indigenous population. In Amerindian students going to provincial schools achieved higher than the Amerindian students going to reserve schools. I want to tell you a little bit, just to back up these data. I was an educational consultant in psychology, educational psychology in particular, for a Northern Community College from about 2001 to 2014. And this data does not surprise me. One of the issues that we had was that people, particularly people from reserve schools, were not reading or doing math at grade level. And in fact, we found people who had graduated who were functionally illiterate in both math and English language arts. So that's a statement of the issue. Now, with this next slide, I want to tie this to the idea of the Enlightenment here. And I'm quoting your president, Gus Lynn Peluso, this is a quote he gave in endorsing Enlightenment values. The Enlightenment recognized the value and worth of the individual, and you all know this. And it's from that recognition that our concept of human rights was developed. what is sometimes forgotten in this era is that while humanists and secularists are quick to recognize that concepts such as the uniqueness and dignity of each individual are part of the Enlightenment, we often fail to remember that the very notion that there's an objective reality that we can discern using that the individual can discern using careful observation and reason. This also flowed from the Enlightenment. And my own contribution to this whole debate was actually published in a book here called The Evolved Self, Mapping and Understanding of Who We Are. And in that book, one of the arguments I make is that the idea that there's an objective reality, the ability for us to take ourselves and treat ourselves as an object, and to remember past events with ourselves in a role that we can imagine alternatives, and then taking that and placing ourselves in possible future events so as we can predict the future given different strategies we may take. That is much older than the European Enlightenment, which is what, 300, 400 years old. I'm dating it back at least 3,000 years that we have had that ability. Now, when we talk about that ability, the whole definition of a human being that we have, Homo sapiens, wise person, is a person with a mind. And what we mean by mind is someone who can be consistent in their thinking, apply rules, a rational judgment, and make decisions and have theory of mind. We can anticipate what other people are thinking because of the circumstances and because of the reaction to the circumstances. All of that is much older than the European Enlightenment. All of that involves volition, which is necessarily individual, and the idea that we're unique human beings. So all of that is what the European Enlightenment did in Europe, of course, is that it gave the individual, the individualism that is inherent in having a self. It made that a good and said it's good to pursue individual knowledge and individual ideas. And I will say this, I don't want to repeat my whole book for you, but that over the centuries, there's been a tension between collectivism, which is part of the self that you can see mapped here, and the individualism, which is also in the self. And part of what we're seeing today is that tension revisited. Now, in understanding Enlightenment values and how these can be transmitted to new cultures, and in the cultures I'm talking about right now, I'm talking about indigenous cultures. We need to understand something of the culture. Here's my argument here. Although we can view science and reason as a technology, and as a technology, it exists separate from the culture that it first evolved in. Actually, it's too much to say that the Enlightenment brought about science. It brought about a method of science. The ideas of science actually are much older than the European Enlightenment and much more cross-cultural. In any case, once the technology is developed, then that technology per se is not culture. It is something that other cultures need to address, and in some ways. And so, while that is true, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution that was part of the European experience, it can be traced back to pre-Enlightenment European culture. That kind of connection needs to be made with other cultures in order for the cultures to adopt the technology as their own. So that's where I'm going with this in terms of the indigenous cultures, indigenous to North America. We must understand the age of colonization as part of that cultural experience. The Enlightenment that began in Europe is transmittable, but as long as it is seen as a foreign cultural European event, and that's how it is sometimes portrayed, then those values will be felt to be foreign values. Taking a look at this map, Age of Colonization, circa 1744, you'll see that the outline of Europe, the outline of the Americas is very much is close to what we see in the modern maps today, except for the Northwest. The Northwest is pictured as unexplored territory yet. The rest of the Americas was divided up by the European powers as part of their empires. Now, word of explanation. The scientific revolution that occurred, also the commercial revolution that occurred in Europe, gave Europe, which for most of its history had been a backwater, a peninsula of attached to the continent where the great civilizations of Persia and India and China existed. That revolution gave the Europeans a lot of power. What do people do with power? Well, historically, all civilizations have created empires, and that's true for wherever in the world you want to go. So it would be surprising if the Europeans had not done this. They went and they established empires. In the map you see before you, you'll see that Quebec extended, that is New France, extended below the Great Lakes. If you drew a line directly west of Toronto, you'd get to Michigan. That was part of the Canadian hinterland. That was the Canadian West at one time. When the British Empire ousted or defeated the French for this part of North America in 1763, the British Empire declared the lands south of the Great Lakes to be Indian lands. The Royal Proclamation said that those lands could not be taken except by treaty. This is exceptionally important, vitally important to understand Canadian history, because part of the issue that the elites, economic elites in Boston and New York had that led to the US Revolution was that they wanted those lands. It was a land grab. Now, eventually, as you know, the US Revolution had succeeded, and then the War of 1812 occurred, which solidified US control of what had been the Canadian hinterland south of the Great Lakes. And the Canadian history after that became one of trying to replace that hinterland. John A. Macdonald's national policy was to replace the Canadian hinterland with the Northwest, which in 1744 had been marked as unexplored. That involved, of course, signing treaties. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here unless there's questions asking me to go into more detail. But essentially, the treaties were necessary to make John A. Macdonald's national policy work, or what we now know as Western Canada would likely have ended up as being part of the United States. The treaties all involved, every treaty involved a promise of education. Education is a treaty right. And so Macdonald had the issue of how to satisfy that treaty need. It was decided to have boarding schools, Indian residential schools, where people from a variety of bands, many of them very small, students could go and have an education. That was the idea. Now, the churches came to MacDonald with a deal, and the deal was this. If the federal government would pay for the construction costs, the churches would cover the operating expenses. Good deal. Canada was cash strapped, having to pay for the National Railroad, which is also was part of MacDonald's national plan. And so a deal was struck. It didn't work. In fact, by 1907, the federal government knew it wasn't working and had decided to shut down the residential schools. Here's a bit of history you probably didn't know. The chiefs and the churches formed an alliance and a lobby group that successfully lobbied to keep them open in 1907. Why would the chiefs do such a thing? Because of the value of education. The old way of life was gone. The buffalo were gone. The fur trade was in decline. There was no way to live by old traditional means. So the chief said we need to have that education guarantee. That, of course, does not in any way justify any of the nasty things that happen at residential schools. Now, here is an example that some people use as something that was nasty that had happened. It's a before and after picture. Thomas More was sent to the Regina residential school in 1874, and his before picture before he entered the school is shown to the left, and very shortly thereafter, the young gentleman on the right appeared. Some people would call that cultural genocide. I am going to argue that in terms of the kind of education that the chiefs were seeking and the kind of values that needed to be taught, if Thomas More had not had his hair cut and did not change his garb, if he had learned those values, he would have been changed inside. And whenever, what is a culture? A culture is the aggregate of the people who are said to make it up. And so when a culture, when the individuals in the culture change, as Thomas More would have changed with an education, then the culture itself is going to change. Culture, therefore, is fluid, but not everybody agrees with that. Some people have said that, have held that culture is a kind of thing. Culture is something one can have or one cannot have. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Back when I was about 20 years old, an elder told me that even if you've got a little bit of Indian ancestry, you can choose to be an Indian or you can choose to be a white, but you can't be both. He saw a real division between the two. It's kind of like there's a story that is told in Mohawk tradition of the two-row wampum, where the white men and the red men are paddling in different canoes but parallel to each other, going forward. And the question was asked, what if somebody wants to be in both canoes? And the answer was, well, a great wind will come up and the person with a foot in both canoes will be blown into the lake, and he will surely drown. that is a reified way of looking at culture. And the reified medicine wheel that I show on the screen here is often spoken of as the medicine wheel. It is as an internal object. But if you look at the medicine wheel, it's divided into physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional. Humanists might have a bit of a problem with the spiritual end because that particular quadrant is used often, very often used to justify supernatural thinking, which humanists and secularists would take exception to. Psychologists might have a problem because emotional is part of mental, but a real giveaway here is that the concept of mental is not native to any Aboriginal cultures, at least in North America, that I know of. In Cree, there's no word for mental, of course, so a word had to be used, and the word that was used means he or she is crazy. So to the chagrin of mental health workers in northern Saskatchewan, they are known as he or she is crazy workers. Doesn't do the mental health field much good. Now, the medicine wheel that you just saw, the four-part medicine wheel, has been elaborated so that it turns slightly in this example, so that the intellect or mind, substitute for mental, is also shown as being in the north, being associated with air, white-skinned people, stars, midnight, death, winter, animals, sweetgrass. The east is shown as yellow-skinned people, the sun, growth, spring, emotional, tobacco. The south, red-skinned people, moon, birth, spiritual. The west, associated with the earth, black-skinned people, maturity, the physical, sage. So as you can see from this depiction of the elaborated medicine wheel, there becomes a whole teaching, a whole dogma, a whole faith, if you will, a worldview as to how the world works. Now, if it's reified, that means that it's held in faith, and that means that it's unchangeable. That this is the way. It has been said that if you're an Indigenous person, you must see the world in this way. I'm not saying that that is a traditional Indigenous belief, but it is a belief that has been repeated from time to time, sometimes by implication. Sometimes it's said that if you have Indigenous ancestry and you don't see this world in this way, then you're unhealthy in some ways. Okay. One of the things that you notice there is a depiction of four races, red, yellow, black, and white. Where did that come from, pray tell? Excellent, excellent. Now I'm hearing my own echo.
There you go.
Okay, thank you, Randall.
Yeah, no problem.
As I was saying, I learned that song in Sunday school, and when I learned it, it was a little bit different. It was red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in his sight. So four races. The song, or the message in the song, was appropriated and added to the medicine wheel. Is that a bad thing? No, that's a good thing, because the medicine wheel can be used as a way of collecting knowledge from various sources and applying it with other pieces of knowledge, and that's exactly what we would like to see happen. The problem with reifying it is once it's reified, then it becomes set in stone. And that's not the traditional purpose I would be arguing of the medicine wheel. Now, another thing I want you to note from that is that the song has been changed. As it has been politically, that is woke politically corrected, it now reads red, brown, yellow, black, and white. That's 5 races. That doesn't fit with the 4-part medicine wheel, but there's a bigger problem there, and that is brown is a substitute for red and yellow. So really, that's only 3 races. But I've got something else to tell you about that, and that is take a look at your skin color. I don't care what race you are. Whites are not really white. Compare yourself to a piece of foolscap if you doubt me. And blacks are not really but black. We are all variations, shades of brown. We're so close in resemblance, in fact, that I would argue that an alien from, well, we can't say Mars anymore, Alpha Centauri, if an alien from Alpha Centauri came down and looked at us, they'd have trouble telling us apart. But psychologically, we notice little differences and we magnify them. Hold that thought. I'm going to get back to it later in the presentation. But before I do that, I would like to interview my nephew Randall, who's already helped out in a couple of ways here. And the reason I want to interview Randall, hi Randall. The reason I want to interview Randall is he's a little bit younger than I am. Okay, I'll say it. He's about 40 years younger than me. So I expect that he might have a different perspective. He's completed his degree in computer programming, and he's also
science.
What's that?
Sorry, computer science. I mean, very similar, but yeah, computer science.
Okay. Sorry, computer science, and he's recently been accepted as a member for membership in the Manitoba Metis Federation. And so, Randall, I'd like to start with that and ask why it was important for you to obtain a membership in the Manitoba Metis Federation.
Well, I'm Métis on my mother's side and her mother, so my grandmother, and it's always been part of. I've always known from young age I was Métis, even though it's wasn't always brought up culturally a lot, but I knew the significance in our family. And my mother was she spent a lot of time researching our lineage to be and it's uncovering a lot of our family history and our ancestry. You were a part of that too, and a part of getting it was help me, like it makes me feel closer to my mother and my grandmother and like their life experiences having been Métis. I myself might, I might not, it might not be obvious that I'm Métis, and people that, can recognize some certain little features, like say, my like cheekbones and stuff. It might be obvious to some people. It's like, oh, you are Aboriginal. Some other people, it's not so clear. Because people with my grandmother, it was very clear, and she's, she had to deal with that image growing up, and that could be something that can be embraced. But it helps me, I want to be close to that side of the family. Like I miss my grandmother. It brings me spiritually closer to that, but it's also just more as well. It's more a bit of validation and just a way to if there to clear up any doubts. And yeah, it's another part that now I've gotten older, I can. As a kid growing up, you're just sometimes you just hear about like you're told, some people, oh, you're we're British, growing up, or oh, we're you're Ukrainian, and you don't necessarily maybe draw those connections as a kid. You just kind of accept it as a reality. But as you get older, I'm starting to understand and appreciate more and investigate more of where our families come from and what they've had to do and how they've grown. And it's yeah, and going and getting it made officially, whether or not it, for myself, it didn't necessarily need to be done, but my mother was very interested, and she was excited too, because it was just something for both of us. So we both got ours verified at the same time, even though she always knew she was Métis, obviously. But yeah, it was also kind of like another bonding moment, and just something that drew us closer together as well.
Did it affect your worldview in some ways, that is being Métis?
um I think, yeah, in maybe an interesting way, or maybe not. I think it's maybe opened my perspective as someone being Métis about being. I don't know. I think I've seen it as being more like I don't need to. It's complicated. I would say like it's helped me like become more aware of inclusivity and all that. And when you're thinking about people, where it's, I think, a lot of times these days we get into a lot of fights about like no sort of the no true Scotsman fallacy, where there's a lot of like purity testing as to who's a part of which group or tribe, or if you're good enough or not. And growing up, it's like I knew I was Métis, but other Aboriginal groups represent themselves differently. Everyone has different experiences. People of similar ethnicities don't have to have the same experiences, and I related to a lot of people who weren't similar ethnicities. Um, so being an ethnicity and maybe not having a strong cultural connection to it as a kid, and maybe gaining more of a connection to it as I got older, it's made me be more accepting and inclusive to people who are understanding or trying to discover themselves, or that, oh, just because you don't check every box doesn't mean you're not a part of it. Just because, thinking about people immigrating to Canada, it's like, oh, just because you're new to Canada, you've only been here for 2 years, doesn't mean you're not Canadian. Stuff like that is maybe being someone who has grown like a little bit removed from his ethnicity, or directly removed from his identity, and getting more of an understanding for it later. I think it's broadened my like understanding and acceptance of tolerance of, it's maybe less divisive, as opposed to like, oh, are you exactly, are you, like sort of, it's not, things aren't as set in stone as you're kind of describing with the medicine wheel, cultures and stuff, and even ethnicities can be, like what's, who is truly Canadian? Is it Indigenous people? Is it people that are anyone born in Canada? Is it Métis? Because Métis kind of came about in Canada, so they're very specific to like specific to Canada, mostly like Manitoba. So it's like, does that make us more Manitoban than other people? And it's like maybe in someone's view, but I don't know. I've never seen it that way. We don't necessarily have to be. We can choose to. I see it as that it's nice that we can choose to embrace this heritage and ancestry, and if that's something you want to embrace about yourself, that's wonderful. But I don't think we don't need to wield it as a weapon or a tool to exclude people as well. We can include things too. Like, if I want to embrace certain things about what my family and my grandmother and stuff, that's wonderful. And if I choose to embrace that, that's great. But I don't need to also use it to just say, oh, well, you're not good enough to hang out with me or be a part of our clique or our club, or you're not, until you start playing hockey and drinking Tim's, you're not going to be Canadian. I mean, I'm not I'm not crazy into hockey, so does that make me not Canadian? It's like, what defines Canadian? That's the beauty thing about being Canada, like Canadian, is that it's very, it's very I don't know, diverse in the sense that it's very open for being like the entry to being Canadian is very open. It's like, we're
Thank
here, we can all work together.
thank you. Now, in your worldview that you're describing, what role do Enlightenment values play in that?
I think out of the Enlightenment, we saw a lot of, like you're describing, a lot of individualism. Like, at least, not that obviously it's always existed. Um, you've always had people that have thought of themselves. Look at all the great monarchs. All the people who put themselves above everyone else. But you have the bracing of, like, it's okay to look after oneself and put oneself first, and it's it's okay to be able to pursue things for your own desires or pleasure or for your own health or comfort. And I think liberty is was one of the most important things that as I get older, I start to value a lot more. Liberty and freedom and having the ability to be oneself, as long as I think the classical, I think most people, I mean, everyone has their own sort of like somewhere on the scale of how much liberty versus how much security, but I think most people are pretty much accepting of like, do what you want as long as you're not harming anyone else or yourself. And I feel like that's a very pervasive value across most like Western culture, especially in Canada, is like you should be free to pursue your happiness as long as it's not coming at the expense of someone else, or say like the public space is like you're free to go build a cottage in the woods, as long as you're not burning down the whole woods for everyone else, right? As long as you're respecting the space, right? So I think as long as you're having respect for people, you can pursue your own liberty. And I think tolerance, like I said before about tolerating people and be more inclusive, but that's another thing about the I think part of the value of sort of the Enlightenment is that the tolerating of other ideas, because you had a lot of like authoritarianism from the church, like these are our ideas, or you had different churches being bodies of authority, but now it's like, okay, well, we can tolerate other lines of thought, and we can pursue different lines of thinking and reasoning and entertain these ideas without it being blasphemy, and we can tolerate and explore things, and we can grow from that. Again, for me, I think as I get older, the most thing I value the most is just the idea that like of respecting more of the individual. Not that collectivism needs to be thrown out, but that the individual is valuable. Like we should be able to respect our freedom to be able to, whether it's you wanting to pursue your own cultural things, whether it's art and music and dance and all that, or just being able to live freely and peacefully and not be not be forced to give up your beliefs, like be converted or such, or have to abandon a culture or something like that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you, Randall. I'm going to move on now because well, time is.
Sorry, I can trail
Well,
on for a bit.
I think, in fact, I'm sure we all appreciate your comments. But yeah, I'm going to do screen share again here, and hopefully I'll get to the right spot. There we are. Okay, here you'll see a picture of the image of a Humanous Perspectives cover from 2014. And I've got an article there talking about Native spirituality or Aboriginal spirituality that has evolved into a religion of sorts. Now, I'm not saying all Native spirituality or Aboriginal spirituality is religion, because traditionally it wasn't. But I'm not going to talk more about the article. I'm just going to point out that it's there. But I will talk about this issue of Humanist Perspectives. The much younger man, this is a 2005 issue of Humanist Perspectives, and the image there is of Chris DiCarlo. And Chris had a speaking engagement in Texas, and you'll notice the t-shirt he's wearing, it says, "We are all African." The theme of his talk was that we are all of African descent. And he saw that as an anti-racist position to be taken. And he was a little bit nervous because he was speaking at a Texas university that, and he thought by reputation, this is redneck country. He had a successful experience, came back to where he was teaching philosophy to a graduate class at Wilfrid Laurier University, gave the same lecture to them, and found himself being investigated because two of his students complained that he was insensitive to the indigenous teaching that indigenous people were placed on the Americas by the Creator. His contract with Wilfrid Laurier was not renewed. At this point, I want to talk about a very recent experience. This is one that was in the news. Last month, a biology major in her final semester reported, quote, "My prof told us that she had a guest lecturer that we should forget everything we knew about biology." The guest turned out to be, in the words of the student, of mixed race, a member of the local Mi'kmaq tribe who described herself as a second eye storyteller. And the second eye storyteller is reported to have said, quote, "As a student, I made sure to spend way more time consulting the elders rather than reading or researching, as it is a better way of finding the truth. Oral histories are actually more valuable than written archives because written archives are biased from a Western lens." I find this attack on science, as I'm sure you do as well, upsetting. Take a look at this this overhead that was used repeatedly by a government of Canada to educate some of its employees. This is taken from an actual workshop. And if you go down to covert white supremacy, you'll see things like color blindness. That is, not making decisions on the basis of race is now considered white supremacy. That's the absolute reverse of what we were fighting for in the 60s and 70s. You'll see near the top of the covert white supremacy part, meritocracy as validation. In the 60s and 70s, we fought for decisions to be made on the basis of merit instead of the basis of race. Gentrification is considered covert white supremacy. What is gentrification? White people fixing up their houses. Now, there's a bit more to it. White people fixing up their houses in areas that are predominantly of a minority, where minority people live. Here's one that I was really upset for. If you look down on that, you'll see erasure of slavery in Canada. Well, in fact, slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the early part of the 19th century. Canada became a northern terminus of the Underground Railroad. A lot of slaves were brought to Canada to freedom. We should be proud of that. What is this? Erasure of slavery in Canada being a sign of white supremacy? It makes no sense, given our history. If you go to the top there, you'll see right at the very top, the words blackface. Back in the 60s and 70s, we fought against hirings and people being placed in universities on the basis of race. Those were racism, overt racism in that era. Now, people who wear makeup to pretend they're somebody else, as our prime minister did repeatedly, by the way, that is now the top of the list as a sign of white supremacy. If that's true, then we do not have a lot of racism in this society, I'll tell you. This next slide is of the medicine wheel at Bighorn, Wyoming. Before I talk about that slide, I want to mention, just connecting the last slide to this one, is abandoning the Enlightenment is not doing us minorities any good. Further, I'm arguing that a reified thinking was never part of Aboriginal culture. And as evidence of that, I want to take a look at this medicine wheel. This medicine wheel is at least 400 years old. And it's constructed of stone rocks. And you will notice that it does not look like our modern medicine wheel. It has 28 spokes connecting from the outside to a central cairn. Not only that, there's 6 cairns around the periphery, stone cairns. Now, what does it mean? Nobody knows for sure. But we do know that it doesn't resemble, it resembles in a way, but does not resemble completely our modern idea of a medicine wheel. Here's a sundial medicine wheel in Alberta. No spokes whatsoever, but there's a series of concentric circles around a central cairn. Here's the Tye Creek medicine wheel in Manitoba. Now, this particular medicine wheel, in the foreground, you'll see a circular structure there. I don't know if you can see my little arrow go, not a circular, this is a triangular structure with a little cross on top of it. And it's near the center of a circle, the north edge of which you can see just beyond this circle. You'll see the beginning of a petriform. It's actually, if you looked at it from above, it would form a thunderbird. 343 stone medicine wheels have been uncovered from Saskatchewan, which is near Saskatoon, to the Gulf of Mexico. Some are divided into 4, the way our modern medicine wheel is, but most are not. Some have a rock center with no division. Some are divided by parallel lines. Now, I'm not the first person to say this, because this particular medicine wheel was created by 4 people, Roberts, Harper, Bull, and Heidemann, and they called it the generic medicine wheel because they said there is no authentic medicine wheel. It's a method. It's not a religious belief. And what they did in their creation, they put holism, balance, and harmony in the middle, and they put uniqueness, which is an individualist approach, power, connectedness, and vision in 4 quadrants. Here's the prior learning, assessment, and recognition medicine wheel created by an Iroquois by the name of Diane, what's her name? Diane Hill. It's divided into 4. She's replaced the spiritual part with intuition. She's added emotional, relational to the standard medicine wheel I first showed you. And this is good. This is using the concept of the medicine wheel, but varying it depending on the context and the learning that needs to be brought forward. Now, I happen to have taken a couple of workshops with Diane way back when, and I've taken her medicine wheel and unconstrained it because she was operating under the assumption that a medicine wheel had to be divided into 4 parts. With her medicine wheel unconstrained, I took the y-axis of mental and physical, and the x-axis of passive and active, and I ended up with, well, the physical side, you could divide that into physiology and behavior, which refines what Diane was actually saying, and then her 3 mental components, emotional, intuition, and cognition is below. So you've got a 5-part medicine wheel. Nothing wrong with that as a medicine wheel. I created a counseling medicine wheel. Now, if you use two variables, then you end up with a 4-part medicine wheel naturally. I use the variables of passive and active on one axis and physical and mental on the other. That leads to 4 quadrants: behavioral, cognitive, emotive, and physiological. And every treatment known to psychology that psychologists use is found in one or sometimes more than one of these 4 quadrants. So my conclusion here is that while the Enlightenment may be viewed as a technology that transcends cultures, the Enlightenment in Euro-American cultures is connected linearly to pre-Enlightenment Europe. Cultures, all cultures, need to make this kind of connection with their earlier forms so as to assimilate the Enlightenment into their own. The risk of not indigenizing the Enlightenment, and I just used one example of the medicine wheel as how it can be done in indigenous cultures. The risk of not indigenizing the Enlightenment is to descend into a new kind of dark age where the values of science and reason that were honed during the European Enlightenment are lost. That is my presentation. I am now open to questions and answers.
Thank you very much to Lloyd and also to Randall for a very informative presentation. We'll now have an opportunity to ask questions. So we'll be using the chat window to accept questions by text. So please type in your question and I'll present it to Lloyd or Randall or both. Please indicate if you have a preference, which isn't to say, Lloyd and Randall, that if the question is directed at one of you, that the other one can't jump in as well. As I mentioned, this session is being recorded. So if you are concerned about your name being used, we will certainly welcome a question to be put anonymously. To start out, we do have one question. And my apologies if I'm not pronouncing the name correct. It's by Mahingan. And the question is, as an Anishinaabe elder, traditional knowledge keeper, and a pipe carrier, I struggle to balance those roles with my profound atheism and, in fact, anti-theism. It feels like a reification of teachings causes many of us to be marginalized within our own communities. How do you manage having a foot in two cultures?
Well, that is a very good question. That is a question that I'm interested in dealing with, and I would like to invite you to contact me and be part of a group to explore answers to that questions, because I don't have a definitive answer to that one. I can tell you that that I have, as Randall, I believe, has adopted some say a foot in both cultures. Yes, actually, we don't have a choice. There's no going back to the old ways. We can learn from the old ways, and we can connect from the old ways. We can connect them to the modern technologies, and I think that's exactly what the chiefs were trying to do when they negotiated the treaties and made education such a priority. That hasn't been done successfully for most people yet, and that's something we need to work on. But you see, if we view culture as being something that you either have it or you don't have it, then we do indeed have a foot in both canoes, and we indeed will fall. that will happen. But that's not the definition of culture that I use. For me, culture is fluid. Culture is whatever we make it. Someone who does not adopt what is seen to be a traditional culture is no less a spokesperson for our people than someone who does. Well, we all have the obligation, the duty almost, to take the world and do the best that we can with the information that we've received, and that will mean modifying our culture. One of the people I worked with was a Métis from northern Saskatchewan, and unlike other people that I worked with, she had no identifiable markers of Aboriginality at all. Yet she had never left her home community. She had never lived in the South. Yet she was she was living life to the best that she could, and maybe that's how the Métis originally evolved. Maybe we evolved by interacting with our environment in the best way we could, and later generations came along and said, "Hey, that's a separate culture." That's how fluid culture is. So what we are doing in assimilating Enlightenment values is developing new Aboriginal cultures with those values. Please contact me. You can reach me at lloydhumanist@sastel.net, and we can carry on this conversation further and make it more fruitful.
Thanks, Lloyd. Randall, did you have any comments about that?
No, sorry, I'm good. I think Lloyd really summed it up very well.
Okay. And then we have a follow-up question. And again, Lloyd, if you want to follow up with the questioner independently, that's fine. But I think this is also of interest. Our local Metis women discount any interpretation of science that contradicts the creation stories that the Anishinaabe migrated from the East Coast to the Lake Superior area following the Metis shells. No amount of science and reason will be tolerated that shows the original migration across the Bering Strait considerably earlier. How do we as Indigenous elders begin the discussion that allows science a place within our cultures?
Another excellent, very good question. And I'm not sure I have a full answer here. I do know, well, let's take a look at our European brothers here. They went through an experience during the Enlightenment that involved in the church. Later became known as the Catholic Church. At that time, it was the word Catholic Church was not normally used, but the church had control over science, and they permitted whatever science agreed with church. The church did not stop science during what's called the Dark Ages or Middle Ages. They controlled science so that only the science that did not contradict church dogma was permitted, and there are numerous examples of that. Then the Enlightenment occurred, and there was a battle. It was a battle for minds, and over time, a new accommodation, a new understanding happened that allowed science to, at first, investigate anything in the natural world outside of the human mind, and then 200 years later, I mean, that was the initial line in the sand. The church would allow science to investigate anything in the natural world, but not the mind, because the mind was of God. That was the idea. So that set psychology back by about 200 years. Now we have the idea that science can investigate anything, and it's not the science that makes, it's the interpretation of science. So science declares what it has investigated within a standard error of measurement, and then then we have to decide what to do with it. Now, here's the challenge in indigenous cultures. We cannot go forward if we're going to hobble science, because that's hobbling our own reason. But we do need to enter into a pact that with whatever science does find, we'll take that into consideration. And that includes evidence of the Bering Strait theory. Because take a look at the example I gave with Chris DiCarlo. Was it fair? He was teaching basic science that we have, that we come from a common human ancestor somewhere in Africa. Is it fair that his contract should not be renewed because he taught that? I come down on one side of that question.
Thanks, Lloyd. Randall, any comments?
No, sorry. I think Lloyd did a very good job of that.
Thanks.
I think the next question should go to Randall first.
Oh, great.
Okay, well, the next question comes from Gus, and so the question is, so you haven't been blown into the lake despite having 1 foot in each canoe. How would you describe your culture, the one you have and the one you are creating?
I'll describe my culture, Gus, the way
So I was going to give Randall a chance to answer this first if he wants to.
Oh,
Sorry.
I mean, I don't know if I have a great answer. I feel like, again, we can sort of form, I think I mean, again, the smallest, like the smallest group is the individual, you know, like everything, just like with things into atoms, into quarks, like the smallest division you can make when it comes to different groups and identities is the individual. And I think every individual is going to have their own interpretation of their culture or their god or whatever it may be. Even if you're part of the same church and religion, in your head, it's like when you're reading a book and, you know, there's no images. You're, you know, unless they give, you know, unless you're J.R., you know, Tolkien, and you're giving extremely dry, like extremely thorough and dry descriptions of exactly, you know, this is how this character should be mostly viewed or seen. Like, people are gonna have their own subtle imaginations or differences of how they perceive their culture themselves, or they include stuff. And I think, yeah, especially with the connectivity of the world as it is now with the internet, people, I mean, for me personally, a lot of the culture I grew up with was a lot of internet culture. A lot of my friends, regardless of, like, most of my friends cultural upbringings, like cultural like commonalities, you know, like I've, you know, a bunch of Jamaican friends, bunch of friends, bunch of some religious friends, like a bunch of friends of different communities, whether it's religious or ethnic, like a lot, but a lot of us were more similar. Just the fact that we were generically Canadian, growing up in the same, like, a lot of Western ideals. And even between our households, it's like we grew up on the internet watching funny cartoons and seeing memes, and that, like, that's the culture we grew up with, and that's what bound us, regardless of our ethnicities or religions. And the thing is, though, like the family culture, the household cultures we grew up with sort of blend with that. So we're each, as these individuals, creating our own little, like, microcosms of these little cultures within ourselves. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, that's why, like, when it comes to this, but this inclusivity and stuff, everyone's gonna view themselves and view each other a bit differently. And that's why, if we can, you know, tolerate and have less explicit definitive things, especially the cultures, which are very abstract, we were sitting here trying to define very abstract things, you start getting it's like with a lot of, like, I guess, like the religious schisms, where you start getting it's the what the narcissism of small differences, where it's like a lot of these different sects are really very similar, you know, to each other, and have almost everything in common, except, you know, one says you have to be baptized at birth, and one says you can only be baptized after, you can't be baptized afterwards. And yet, no, they have 99% in common. They are in disagreements, and not to say that they're enemies, but they may be rivals or might not completely tolerate each other. And it's like, well, really, you're basically the same. You're brother and sister. You have so much more in common, but you're getting hung up on these little details. And I feel like, in general, if a lot of these different, you know, people with our all these different cultures, if we can see more of the similarities between each other, I think we, as Canadians, having a lot of diverse cultures, with all, like, you know, the Indigenous, and with all the people that are immigrating, people that are born here, plus all the people that are immigrating now, like, we can again see the humanity between us, and from there we can keep building and evolving newer cultures that are completely, you know, especially, again, the thing I think of is like the internet, whereas it's like it's removed from any, like, traditional culture, like it's really its own thing, and new culture has been created on the internet, whether it's like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. It's like we can create a lot of these things that are completely separated from, say, like a spiritualistic ritual from the past. It's just like completely almost of its own, like it's just of its own creation. And from there, it's just like, I don't know, it's nice because it feels like it's not as, like, as bound to everything else. Like, you know, regardless of your ethnicity, you can just join it. You can go online and join a meme, or watch a funny video of your favorite creator, and you can just choose to join the community you want. Especially with the interconnectivity, you're not necessarily stuck in your local culture, and you can adopt new ideas and perspectives, you know. And I think that's great. I think, you know, that's having, like, different foot in different cultures. I mean, I think what Lloyd said before is that there is no going back, and you're kind of forced to keep, all these individuals are forced to keep evolving, and to resist it, it's almost going to be futile. You might be able to slow it down, but eventually it's going to come to a head where it's like, okay, well, you know, we really have to adopt now. And had we been slowly integrating and working towards it at our own pace instead of fighting it, we would have we would have adopted better, assimilated or integrated our own culture or their culture better, as opposed to just fighting it. Because if you look at, like, the, you know, the prognosis in the long run, it's like, you can't just completely stay isolated. You're not going to be able to completely preserve it, and the amount of effort you put into completely trying to keep it all pristine and preserved as the way it once was, like that effort could be, that's going to be added to a lot of frustration and a lot of like someone's life spent that might just be undone anyway. So it might be better to just recognize that we're going to have to change, but it'll be on our terms. We'll adopt it how we want to, but to completely resist it is just not gonna, it's not gonna be, there's no benefit to do that. It's just gonna be a lose-lose. Whereas you could at least maybe gain something out of it, or again, go out on your own terms if you want to look at it like that. Anyway, sorry, I'll pass on to Lloyd.
Thanks, Randall. Lloyd, go ahead.
I think Randall gave a very complete and good explanation. I just want to add one little point. In my private practice, I treat each client as a culture of one. I think that's a good perspective we could take to all of us. I'm a culture of one, and I adopt pieces from all my experiences, and I think that's a good way of summarizing all of us.
Thank you, Lloyd. Here's a question from somebody in France, and it's sort of a little bit about legality and a little bit about land claims and ownership. And so the question goes, I live in France, and I'd like to know if there are lands in Canada that don't belong to a legal entity, and if it is actually legally possible to build a cabin where you could reside in the woods.
I don't know. Randall, do you know the answer to that? I don't think there are, but I don't really know.
I mean, if you should, it's kind of funny. I mean, Lloyd, I guess within our own family, Lloyd, we have, I guess we have like great grandpa's property,
Yeah.
Bird Lake, but it's different. That's not the exact same, but with our ancestors, not that far back, but for me, it would be 3 generations ago. Some of our grandparents, they out in northeast Manitoba, closer to Ontario, in the Nopaming Provincial Park, which it is now, my great grandfather and 2 of his 4, I think it was 3 of his friends, they went and claimed land and built cottages on the lake, Bird Lake. And they chose, and this was before anyone else had been there. I mean, people might have portaged there and explored there, but nothing had been developed. Now it has a small campground, and there's probably about 100 cottages on one side of the lake, which has road access. My grandfather, or my great grandfather, and his friends built on the other side of the lake with no road access. The only way to access it is through boat, or a very, 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 very long walk, which no one, I don't think, has ever done. No one wants to walk around a lake. But yeah, that was before the land was ever provincial park. Obviously, I think it's, crown land. So I think when it comes to the question, I think in Canada, unless it's been designated as given as treaty land, I think all land is still parceled and accounted for. But back then, I guess the reason I think it's neat is because back then it wasn't a provincial park, and they had basically just staked a claim on that land. And now when it comes to the cottages there that are built there, they're built as leases on the provincial park, whereas our cottage, we basically have unique squatters' rights due to our family's heritage and having that land before they decided to make the distinction of a provincial park. And I think this would have been built, it was either just pre-World War II or just after World War II. I think it was pre-World War II. Like the first property there was, I think, 80 years ago. The first building there, or it's something like 70, 78 or 80 years ago at this point. I can't remember the exact year. But it's unique because, yeah, we have squatters' rights. We have a unique sort of entitlement to that land than other people do. So I think back in the day, you did have the opportunity, and surprisingly enough, I guess they have respected the rights of the people who did have that land, which I guess maybe is a bit characteristic of the treaties that they've done for other people. Though this is not in this land, this entitlement to this land is not in an Aboriginal context, but just happens to be just kind of a funny coincidence that we have this unique little experience with having land ownership prior to the crown actually making a ruling on it. But it's very, and in a sense that I feel like our family does feel close to that, because our great grandfather and his friends had to, this is back in the day where it was like, okay, you portage your stuff in there, you portage all your stuff across, or you wait till the winter and then somehow if you could afford a snowmobile at the time or some kind of equipment to drag it across, and here's like we have gigantic cast iron stove / heater, and that's original. And to imagine them bringing that across the lake in the winter on some sort of sled, it's just, and it's all built by hand. This isn't someone that's flown in and they're dropping materials off. Like, it was a lot of hard work and effort, and it's heritage that's like, it's one of the few things of sort of our family that we can look back on and say that's us, like that's our family's culture and our family's sort of like, the cottage to us, in a sense, it's not even a very fancy cottage, but the cottage to us, in a sense, that space is kind of like our cultural little like heirloom, family heirloom. Anyway, I'll pass on to Lloyd.
Go ahead, Lloyd.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Next comment or question it comes from Marty Shoemaker, and the question is: most nomadic and indigenous cultures millennia ago were identified by their bloodlines, and this was boosted by the ownership of property in an agrarian age. I'm wondering if currently in the Amerindian cultures have maintained the family name and ties as more important than group or individual identities, and is this changing with moves to cosmopolitan areas and modern social media, as was referred to by Randall?
Do you have a comment on that, Randall?
I'll let you take it first. I might have a comment, but I'll let you take it first.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand the question in its entirety, Marty, but I could tell you that in terms of Indigenous bands in the Northern Plains and in Northern Canada, we're basically talking about extended families. Traditional bands were, as I'm sure you know, between about 100 and 150 usually people. And they were nomadic, and new bands were always forming because you get groups within bands as they got larger that didn't agree with the direction of the majority, and they go off and form their own band. In all of the research I've met, and in all my personal experience, an attachment to the land is important, and in fact, because of that attachment, in northern Saskatchewan, where I practiced most of my life, I would often tell people who are having difficulties in a more urban environment to go spend some time on the trap line, because every family had one. And what they did on the trap line that was therapeutic was individualized. But part of being on the trap line is being separate from the pressures and enticements of town, and being able to connect to nature and to feel that connection, and that brings a new perspective on things. I think I'm going off in a bit of a tangent here, but one of the most successful programs that we've had in one of the communities that had a very high youth suicide rate in northern Saskatchewan was one where the youth were taken onto the land to learn wilderness survival skills. That became very popular. And that was part of the program, which is a community. I mean, it was very extensive. Like, one of the things that they did is they built a whole lot of lockers at the local co-op store, so everybody could lock up their rifles, because that had been a source of that had been problematic. So there was a lot of things going on, but the wilderness survival thing was the thing that really stuck out in the minds, particularly young men that had been at risk. So that's a kind of connection to the land, but it's not the same as land ownership. Land ownership, well, that came with the Europeans.
Thanks, Lloyd. That was the end.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't, just want to make sure. Another question about different perspectives. I've heard many Indigenous people refer to different ways of knowing to justify ideas, opinions, and personal beliefs. Have you found a way to explain that these things are not the same as knowing in the scientific sense?
Another excellent question. That's a challenge we face. I had a professor who once, this was at my doctoral level at the University of Calgary, who published an article that said that science was a white male way of knowing. Well, think about that for a moment. Does that mean that if you're not white male, you can't do science? And if you can't do science, doesn't that block you from a whole lot of new knowledge that you could generate and create? But the question actually speaks to something more basic than that. And that is, what is the nature of knowledge? Are there different ways of knowing? My answer to that is no. That our ways of knowing, the idea that we can, by careful observation, learn new things and how things work, is a very, very old and cross-cultural idea. I estimated in my book that it's about 3,000 years old, at least. When we observe and think of different possibilities and decide, okay, this is likely the answer, we're doing science. It might not be formal science, but and then that's what elders, I think, do as well. Now, what happens when we buy into the idea that there is different ways of knowing is we're placing non-rational means of knowing at the same level as the rational and scientific ways of knowing. We're saying they're alternate, like my professor said in his statement. That's elevating religion to the level of science. That's saying, okay, you can choose this belief, and that's just as good. Anybody's belief is just as good as anybody else's belief, but that's not what we as human beings do, are evolved to do in terms of our use of mind. Because to have a belief, we have to have evidence for that belief. Otherwise, it's not a belief. It's just something that we live by without evidence, and that's not a belief. That is a faith. Now, can there be evidence for a faith? Well, yeah, I suppose you could treat it as a hypothesis. I'll give you an example. Big Lake, northern Saskatchewan. Waves come up. Got to put tobacco on the shore before you cross to mollify the spirit of the lake. If that's what you do, if that's the practice, you do it until you find evidence that, hey, this is not needed anymore. And there's various circumstances where that could come out. Now, if you're holding it religiously, you'll continue the practice regardless of the evidence. If you're not holding the belief religiously, then when you find evidence that this practice doesn't make any difference one or the other, you stop the practice. Now, in the second example, there's only one way of knowing. In the first example, you use other ways of knowing as an excuse to continue a practice without having to examine it.
Thanks, Lloyd. Any comments, Randall?
Yeah, I think it's maybe slightly similar idea is that I guess you could say, like, Lloyd was commenting that there's one way of knowing. And I mean, well, I guess I agree in the sense. I guess the start discussion comes between, like, you have truth, and then you have like metaphorical truth. So sort of what Lloyd was discussing with like putting the tobacco on the shore, and it calms the waves so you can cross, and that might be the metaphorical truth might be seen as like a type of wisdom. So you might have this hole in the ground, and your elder or your religious leader tells you, well, you shouldn't go stick your arm into holes in the ground because the devil will bite you. And it's like, well, that might be metaphorically true, because it is wise to not stick your hand in places that you don't know what's in there. And that wisdom will serve you and it will be fine. But when you look at the actual truth of it, it's like, oh, because there's snakes in the holes and they bite you, and that's the actual truth of it. But the wisdom effectively communicates the same idea, and I mean, yeah, the wisdom still applies to the actual truth, like, oh, you shouldn't, it's wise to not stick your hand in places, because why would you do that? Who knows what's in there, right? Like, so the things, we have a lot of like these like metaphors, and again, a lot of metaphorical truths and wisdom, which I think ends up becoming conflated or misconstrued or blended with what we think of as like objectivity, which is like, we've done observations, we've done measurements, they're reviewed, and we've been able to observe things and say, yes, electrons revolve around a nucleus, and we're able to, like, for example, if we didn't have a complete understanding of how science and electromagnetism worked in quantum physics, computers wouldn't work. Computers aren't just magical, like, they're very precise. A couple bits not operating correctly, or electrical circuits in their logic gates not operating correctly, and the computers don't work. So for a computer to work, we very much have to have a clear understanding of how electronics work and logic, and how electromagnetism works on like a quantum level. It's not just, it's precise. Again, it's not just kind of like, oh, I can slap the TV and it starts working, or I can jiggle this thing in the car and it's not working. Analog things, maybe with analog stuff, like a combustion engine, you have a little more leeway, but digital stuff, it's very much like it works or it crashes and it doesn't. So and stuff like that's very objective, and you can't really have much discussion about that. So it's like, if you have computers work, and you kind of have to accept there's objectiveness about that, but it doesn't mean we have to discard wisdom, and metaphors and analogies, because they can be they're a lot more relatable, a lot more easier to grasp, and they're very good at introducing things. And it's not to say elders shouldn't have to throw away stories and wisdom, just like, it's the difference between people can look at stories like the Bible, and they can see a lot of wisdom, and see a lot of a lot of the thoughts that led to our enlightenment, where it's like, oh, we should, think about each other. We should, try to, even look at like the commandments, there could be a lot of liberty seen in the commandments, like, thou shalt not steal, or hurt one another, or murder, or like covet someone's wife. It's like, oh, it's kind of about respect and liberty, and though, like, you can see that wisdom there, but you can then translate it and evolve from it. So like, a lot of like, Aboriginal culture still has plenty of value. It's just, are you going to sit there and be very righteous and stubborn about, like, no, it has to, if it's not exactly true, if you aren't on top of, if the earth isn't turtles on top of turtles on top of turtles forever, then my worldview completely crashes. I mean, if that's the case, well, then things might be more difficult for you. And that can go for anyone who has very strict beliefs that they're trying to reconcile, and like, with the cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is painful, but it's the part of the process that lets us, helps us grow and understand. But yeah, and again, we don't have to discard wisdom, but understanding, like, it's, again, the things, we get the same wisdom from, say, like movies, like the Marvel movies and all this stuff, and cartoons and all this, and all these books, and Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of wise things and a lot of truths and stuff we can learn from there, but we don't have to accept that, Mordor and Sauron and all that stuff is true and real, to be able to understand and to be able to relate to it. It doesn't have to be real to relate to it, understand the message. And I think maybe that's sort of the role that what's seen as maybe Aboriginal spirituality needs to sort of migrate its way to, is more of like more of like oneself and wisdom, and being, more mindfulness, as opposed to spirituality, and more, I mean, it'd still be spiritual. No one says that you can't be spiritual, but not necessarily, like, again, a lot of people nowadays can still be Christians and believe in God, but still embrace science. And they just, they don't have to believe that the earth was created in, 7 days, to believe that maybe the earth was still, created, or the universe was. And again, that's the thing about, like, with the church, it's had time to sort of evolve with a lot of the Enlightenment stuff, whereas with a lot of indigenous cultures, it might have been a very culture shock, quick introduction. Whereas, again, you've had, religions in like the Middle Eastern Abrahamic religions have had millennia to very much grow with society in themselves. Like, society has sculpted them, and they've sculpted society. It's been very reciprocal. So I think that's maybe the big struggle, is that there hadn't been times to, like what Lloyd is describing with indigenizing science and the medicine wheel and all that stuff. That process kind of is happening now. It's happening now and in the future, and it's you know, now that several hundred years have passed, now we're starting to see the evolution of it, because I guess it has to take place sometime. But I mean, it's kind of cool that we get to experience that, but it's very difficult, because that's where a lot of like the details has to be hashed out, and there's a lot more controversy and discussion that happens. But hopefully, you know, in the future things, you know, will resolve, and we'll all be a lot happier for it. Anyway, that's all.
I thank you, Randall. You reminded me of something very important there, and I'm agreeing with what you say, especially like your story about the hole in the ground. Cultural wisdom is an evolved structure. It evolved because it works, and or for the most part, and so people follow it because they expect it to work. And if it works, there's got to be some basis there, even if it hasn't been studied scientifically. So to that degree, I endorse what you're saying completely. Now, taking that to indigenous cultures, I'm going to give you an example, a historic example. When the Cree left the woodland and invaded the plains along with their Assiniboine allies and defeated the Dakota and Lakota Sioux and pushed them south, they ended up adopting plains culture. That is the buffalo culture. And the buffalo culture includes things like the powwows and the sun dances and the horse dances and things like that. Things that they did not have in the woodland. Now, in adopting the culture of the plains, they were basically saying, okay, this is what works in this context, so we're going to do it this way. They were not, a religious attitude would say, these were our beliefs that are truth for us, and we've had them since time immemorial, and it doesn't matter that we're going into the plains, we're going to continue the same practices that we had in the bush. You see the difference there? That there are ways of doing things that work, and we may not know, we may not understand why. We'll leave that to science to decide, but we follow them anyway. And that's what that's part of what I take to be cultural wisdom.
Thank you, Lloyd. We have time for one last question, and then we'll close. This question is from Gus. How did the medicine wheel become reified? Was it Europeans, and where do the Aboriginal people stand on this now? Is the reified wheel still used, or is it seen as a fluid thing? So similar to what you were just saying about adopting different cultures as it might become suitable.
Gus, that is a very good question. There have been some tough questions thrown at me and Randall here. The answer is that the medicine wheel that I presented as a reified medicine wheel has been developed. We can trace much of its development to European influences, like I did for the 4 races, for example. There are other European influences that might surprise you. For example, the idea of Mother Earth has a European origin, but it will take me too long to get into that particular thread in this particular session. The answer is a little bit of both, but there are people who have adopted the reified form as a kind of a religified Aboriginal spirituality, who are saying that you need to have this belief system if you're Aboriginal. And if you don't have this belief system, then there's something wrong about you. Maybe you're unhealthy. Maybe you're a victim of historic trauma. I don't agree with that. As a psychologist, I can diagnose trauma. And I don't diagnose trauma on the basis that someone does or does not have a particular set of beliefs that are viewed by some people to be essential. That's what I mean by reification. I'm much more fluid, and I think in the Indigenous community, the reified people have the upper hand right now.
Thanks, Lloyd. Randall, any last comments?
I guess, yeah, I just want to, because I was just having a thought, because I think we've seen this with other different groups. Like you get different, like other, like any group that finds itself in a position of like a minority, wherever they may be. Wanted to ask Lloyd, do you think some of the reification is based upon like banding together? Like, for example, you might see, um, it's not very like exactly the same, but something like the LGBT banner, where it's whether or not a lot of these groups have exactly the same interests or same needs, they can all band together because sort of like, again, like together we can, fight for our causes and our strengths, and we can be better represented if we're, if we can all agree on something, or come around something. And with indigenous groups, that might be it might be a symbol, it might have been seen as like a symbol or a point of unification, or something that can be recognized as distinctly Aboriginal, that they can point to and use and say, like, this is, just something they can coalesce around, and probably help maybe, um I don't know, I think you're understanding maybe my point. Is that part of it?
I fully agree that there's this is worrisome, but there is a certain amount of we them mentality here, and then if you're part of the we, that you have to conform to the norms of the we. And as human beings, we're social beings, we're social animals, and we have this tendency to conform to those in our immediate group. That's sometimes necessary for group cohesion, yes, but that can also lead to errors, and it can lead to the xenophobia. But there's another factor that I think you were alluding to too as well, and I think we've seen it in other parts of the world, that when the obstacle seems insurmountable, people often turn to supernatural means. And in Indigenous history, for example, we had the ghost shirt movement. That if you wore a particular shirt and performed a certain ritual, you'd be invincible. The bullets of the U.S. soldiers will bounce off you. Well, that proved to be not, it didn't work very well. But it's that kind of thinking, and that there are different movements in the 19th and early part of the 20th century that held that if certain rituals were performed, the creator would send all the Europeans back to Europe, well, where they came from. That didn't work very well either. But you definitely have this tendency that if the task is set forward for you seems insurmountable, well, maybe there'll be supernatural means that can still carry that task forward. And partly that's what we're facing.
Thanks, Lloyd. We're just going to close the meeting now, and thanks to everybody. Lloyd or Randall, if you have a final couple of words, go ahead.
Go ahead, Randall.
Okay. I just wanted to thank everyone for having me. Hopefully, though I don't believe I'm any much an expert or knowledgeable about many things, hopefully I was able to contribute to this discussion with my perspective and experience. So thank you very much for bringing me on.
My thanks as well. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Well, again, thanks again to you, Lloyd, and to you, Randall, for your presentation and for the thoughtful answers to the questions. And thanks for all the great questions from the participants. Sorry if we missed one of your questions. If you want more information about Lloyd's books or other work, you can visit his website at hawkeyeassociates.ca. Just a couple of closing remarks about CFI Canada. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. We hope that those of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to our membership page in the chat window and also through Meetup. Hope that you will consider joining. Not only does your membership provide financial support to CFIC, it also adds your voice to that of others who support science, critical thinking, and secularism. As we grow in numbers, so does our influence with government decision makers and the public opinion that guides them. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policy, healthcare, public education, and human rights. If concerns like climate change, blasphemy laws, education curriculum, medical pseudoscience are important to you, please consider becoming a CFIC member. Without us, the major influences will continue to be the large self-interested groups and institutions that benefit from making baseless claims and spreading pseudoscience. Finally, I'd like to thank all the CFIC volunteers who help with this and our other events. If you'd like to volunteer with CFIC, you can sign up on our website. There are many interesting positions for you to choose from. Once again, thanks again to our speakers. And since clapping doesn't work very well in Zoom, I invite you to express your appreciation by clicking on the reactions tab, and that's where you can use the clap icon or the thumbs up icon or whatever it is you might like. And again, I'm going to post the link to our website, centerforinquiry.ca, in case anybody wants more information. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.